Think about any agreement, really, but especially something as complex as a construction contract. I mean, at its core is this shared idea of what a good job looks like, right?
Yeah.
But what happens when that idea doesn't quite match reality, after the work is technically complete?
That's the big question, isn't it? And in construction, the FID Red Book, the 2017 version, gives us a pretty detailed map for navigating those, well, tricky situations.
Right.
Today, we're really diving into how this standard contract
Yeah.
handles defects, those things that aren't quite right that maybe only show up after the main build is done.
Exactly. The Red Book is, well, it's a really widely used framework, a sort of rule book for these big projects.
Right.
And our mission today is to unpack the key ways it deals with these post-completion issues, making sure what gets built is actually what was agreed.
And this isn't just, dry legal stuff. Understanding these clauses is genuinely vital for anyone involved. Whether you're managing work on site or you're the one actually using the building or facility afterwards, it's all about accountability and quality.
Okay, so let's picture it. The project's wrapping up, the employer's ready to take possession. Where does the Red Book first start talking about things maybe not being perfect?
Well, it kicks off around Clause 10, which deals with taking over. That's the formal bit where the employer accepts the works, or maybe just a part of them.
Okay.
But critically, the contract knows that even then, or maybe soon after, issues can emerge. And that leads us straight into Clause 11, which is literally called defects after taking over.
So the handover itself isn't necessarily the final word on the contractor's quality obligations then.
Not at all.
So what's the first check? How are these initial problems flagged?
Subclause 10.1 is really central here. When the contractor thinks they're done, they apply to the engineer for a taking over certificate. Now, this engineer figure is meant to be this impartial expert.
Right.
They can issue the certificate if they agree, yes, it's done. But crucially, they can also reject the application. And if they do, they have to specify what's still outstanding, or, importantly, list any defects that need fixing before they'll issue that certificate.
Makes sense. A formal checkpoint before the full handover. What if the engineer is slow to respond to the contractor's application?
Okay, this is interesting. It puts a bit of pressure on. Subclause 10.1 says if the engineer doesn't issue the certificate or reject the application formally within 28 days,
20 days.
and, assuming the work is basically done and usable, then the taking over certificate can be deemed to have been issued.
Wow, okay. So, like, a ticking clock there encourages the engineer to act.
Right.
For contractors, keeping good records of that application must be key, in case they need that deemed status.
Absolutely vital. And what about projects handed over in parts sections?
Good questions.
Subclause 10.2 covers that. If the employer takes over just a specific part, the engineer should issue a certificate just for that part pretty quickly.
Right.
And importantly, that certificate for the part will also list any outstanding bits or defects specifically for that section.
Okay, so there's that initial check at taking over. But what about things that, aren't obvious straight away? Problems that only show up after things have been used for a bit. That's where this defects notification period fits in, isn't it?
Exactly. The defects notification period, often called the DNP, that's in subclause 11.1. Think of it like a warranty period, basically, that starts after the employer takes over.
Okay, warranty period. Okay.
During this specific time frame, the contractor is still on the hook for fixing any defects or damage that crops up.
And how long is that period typically under the Red Book?
Well, the guidance notes usually suggest 12 months as standard. But, and this is really important, the actual length for any given project is always set out in the contract data.
The project specifics.
Exactly. It can be shorter, it could be longer. It depends on the agreement.
And what if there were still some minor things left to do when that first taking over certificate was issued? Does that impact this DNP?
It certainly can. Subclause 11.1 links the DNP directly to any outstanding work that was listed on that taking over certificate. So if work is still being finished after taking over, the DNP for the relevant parts might only start or extend until that work is actually done.
Okay, so it can stretch a bit. Is there a cap on that? A maximum extension?
Yes, there is. For certainty, subclause 11.1 puts a limit. The DNP can't be extended by more than 2 years beyond its original expiry date, the one specified in the contract data.
2 years max extension.
Got it. So during this DNP, what exactly does the contractor have to do about these defects?
Their main job under 11.1 is simple. Finish any leftover work and fix any defects they're told about during the DNP.
How are they told?
Usually the engineer kicks things off by issuing instructions, formal instructions, detailing the defect and what needs doing.
And if the contractor, say, drags their feet on fixing things?
Well, the contract anticipates that. If the contractor doesn't act reasonably quickly after getting those instructions, 11.1 gives the employer the right to step in.
I mean, they can hire someone else to do the repair work. And unless it's work the original contractor would have been paid extra for anyway, the employer can charge the cost of that repair back to the original contractor.
Ouch. So there's a real incentive for the contractor to be responsive.
Definitely. It underlines their responsibility during the DNP.
And does the employer have to, collect all the problems and present them at the end of the DNP, or can they raise them as they find them?
Oh, absolutely raise them as you find them. Subclause 11.2 is clear. The employer or engineer can notify the contractor about a defect anytime it's discovered during the DNP. No need to wait.
Makes sense. Now, practically, if the contractor needs to get back on site to fix something during the DNP, how does that work? Access rights.
Subclause 11.6 deals with access. If the contractor needs to get onto the site or into a specific part of the works to fix a defect, they have to give the employer formal notice.
A notice? What does that involve?
It needs to say which parts they need access to, why they need access, and their preferred dates and times. And they need to give reasonable warning, considering any security rules the employer might have.
And the employer's side, can they just say no?
They have 7 days to reply after getting the notice. They can consent or they can refuse. But if they refuse, they have to give reasons. Subclause 11.6 also mentions that if the employer helps arrange access, but the contractor then messes up by not following security rules, well, that could cause problems for the contractor.
Okay. Sometimes, though, fixing something might be easier off-site, like a piece of equipment, maybe. Does FIDIC cover taking stuff away for repair?
Yes, it does. Subclause 11.5 has a process for fixing defects in what it calls plant, machinery, equipment, that sort of thing, away from the site.
Right.
If the contractor thinks fixing a piece of plant on site isn't practical or quick, they can send a notice to the employer asking for permission to remove it.
And what info needs to be in that notice?
It has to clearly identify the plant, describe the defect, say where it's going for repair, detail the transport and insurance plans, and outline how it'll be inspected and tested after the repair. It's quite thorough.
Seems reasonable. What's the employer's role then?
They can put conditions on their consent, maybe about timing or inspection rights. And once the repair is done, the contractor has to bring it back, reinstall it, and this is key, retest it to prove the fix worked.
And if they don't bring it back or fix it properly by the agreed date?
Then 11.5 points towards potential consequences. The employer might look at claiming against the performance security that financial guarantee under subclause 4.2.2, or they could issue a formal notice to correct under 15.1, which is a step towards potentially terminating the contract if the failure persists. So again, serious implications.
So once a defect is repaired, is that it, or is there retesting involved generally?
Good point. Subclause 11.3 covers retesting after repairs. If the engineer decides that any plant, materials, design elements, or workmanship needs retesting after a defect's been fixed, those tests have to be done again.
And who pays for that retesting?
This is important. The tests are repeated according to subclause 7.4, which explicitly states these retests are at the contractor's risk and cost.
Okay, contractor's cost. What if the retest shows it still isn't right?
Well, if the original failure and the subsequent retesting cause the employer extra costs, maybe delays, extra supervision, whatever subclause 7.4 allows the employer to claim those additional costs back from the contractor.
Right. So it really pays for the contractor to get the fix right the first time.
Definitely. Avoids a lot of potential pain later.
We've covered finding defects, fixing them, testing the fix. What marks the official endpoint? When does the contractor's main liability for these defects wrap up?
That milestone is the performance certificate. It's covered in subclause 11.9. The engineer issues this certificate once basically all the work is done according to the contract, including fixing any notified defects properly.
Are there any nuances around issuing that certificate? What if there are tiny things still outstanding?
Yes, 11.9 allows for that. If there are just very minor bits of work or minor defects left, the engineer can list these before issuing the performance certificate. And, like the taking over certificate, there's a deemed issuance provision too.
Ah, another 28-day clock.
Exactly. If the engineer doesn't issue the certificate within 28 days of the contractor asking for it, assuming the DNP is over and work is complete, it's deemed to have been issued.
So the performance certificate is a big deal, but does it mean the contractor is completely off the hook for everything from that point on?
Not quite entirely. Subclause 11.10 is called unfulfilled obligations. It basically says that even after the performance certificate, both parties, employer and contractor, are still liable for any allegations they haven't fulfilled yet.
So the contract sort of stays alive for those specific loose ends.
In a sense, yes, for completing those specific duties.
But surely there's a long stop date for liability, especially for defects in things like machinery, the plant.
Yes, 11.10 does provide a specific cutoff for plant. The contractor generally isn't liable for defects or damage to plant that happens more than 2 years after the DNP for that specific plant has expired.
2 years after the DNP ends for that item.
Correct. But, and this is a big but, this limitation doesn't apply in certain serious situations. Things like illegal acts, fraud, gross negligence, deliberate default, or reckless misconduct. Those override the time limit.
Okay, so some serious bad behavior keeps the liability open. Finally, disagreements seem almost inevitable sometimes. Maybe about whether something is a defect or who caused it. How does FIDIC suggest handling those?
Yeah, disputes happen. The Red Book has a tiered approach. First, you might try to resolve it through the engineer's process for agreement or determination under subclause 3.7.
The engineer acts as a first referee, almost.
Kind of, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If that doesn't work, either side can trigger the formal claims procedure in subclause 20.2. If it's still not sorted, it becomes a formal dispute. Then it can go to the Dispute Avoidance Adjudication Board, the DAB, under Clause 21. And if even that doesn't resolve it, the final step is typically international arbitration.
So it's a structured path, from engineer's decision to claims to DAB to arbitration if needed. Seems quite comprehensive. Right, let's try and summarize. What are the absolute core takeaways on how FIDIC Red Book 2017 handles defects?
I'd say the key things are, 1, the central importance of the defects notification period, that DNP is the main time window for contractor responsibility. 2, the clear processes for notification, access, and repair during that DNP. 3, the consequences if the contractor doesn't fulfill their obligations.
Right.
4, the performance certificate is a major milestone, but not a total wipe clean of all obligations. And 5, that structured dispute resolution process if disagreements do arise.
It really seems to strike a balance, doesn't it? Trying to ensure the employer gets what they paid for even after handover, while also giving the contractor a defined period of responsibility. Understanding all this feels, well, essential for managing these contracts smoothly and, hopefully, avoiding big fights.
Couldn't agree more. It's about managing expectations and risks on both sides. And actually, on that note, maybe a final thought for you listening.
Yeah.
Thinking about that balance of responsibilities during the DNP and all the procedures we've discussed,
Yeah.
what do you think are some of the most common practical challenges or friction points that tend to spark disputes on real projects? Where do things often go wrong in practice?
Yeah, that's a good question to ponder. Definitely worth thinking about the real-world application. If you are dealing with construction contracts or just curious, really digging into the full FID, Red Book 2017 is highly recommended. It's dense, but the detail is crucial. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.